Somebody gave me, would you like a mirth moment?
Yes.
Somebody gave me in the church yesterday some wonderful, I love mirth moments. I have a sense of humor. I know it can be a significant defect sometimes, but I do think God loves laughter. This is about those wonderful church bulletins that sometimes have incredible bloopers in them. We, of course, have gone beyond that, if that's the right expression. Here are one or two. The sermon this morning, Jesus walks on the water. The sermon tonight, searching for Jesus. I must introduce a pedantic moment here. In the Aramaic, it says very clearly, Jesus walked by the water. But never mind, we won't go there. Miss Charlene Mason sang the hymn, I Will Not Pass This Way Again, giving obvious pleasure to the congregation. Mercifully, we don't have that problem. Here's a rather naughty one. For those who have children and don't know it, we have a nursery downstairs. Irving Benson and Jessie Carter were married on October the 24th in the church. So ends a friendship that began in their school days. And lastly, the Low Self-Esteem Support Group will meet on Thursday at 7. Please use the back door. My wife and I have been married, I hesitate to tell you, 51 years, and she has been my companion during those... And although she is now, she says, retired from ministry, I think she will be a help to us while we're here. I would like to say one thing. Please know that I am very available to you. I won't be here all of the week because we live in the San Juan Islands, very beautiful, as you know. But I have a telephone, a special telephone number, and if you want to call me, any of you, at any time, you may do so. While I'm here, of course, if you want to see me or make an appointment, please do so. I'm 100% accessible to you, and I want you to know this. Even if you just want to call and give me some mirth moments, that's fine. Thank you. Well, I want to share some ideas this morning. I don't sermonize, and I don't lecture, at least not in this role. What I do and what I'd like to do is share ideas. And I have some ideas about change that I'd like to share with you this morning. Now, you may do with these ideas anything you please. They're not copyright. If you want to come up with your own ideas on change, that's fine. But I want to share ideas about change, and I'll tell you why that is. Because change is very much a part of our experience today. It's very much a part of our experience in our own lives, in our personal relationships, in our jobs, even in our bodies. Change seems to have accelerated to some degree. When I talk to people who've had long lives, they tell me that change was not so prevalent in those days, early days, partly, I suppose, because people didn't move around as much as they do now. But change seems to be so much a part of our experience. And yet, so many of us fear change. We're afraid of change. Although, oddly enough, there's something in us that also seems to crave change. There's something inherently present in our makeup, instinctively so, one might say, that urges us to see change as part of an essential progression through life, as a necessary step toward the transformation spiritually that we seek. So there's an element, shall I say, of ambivalence in our thinking when we consider change. We know change is going to come, and we're ready for it, and some of us crave it. And then we're rather fearful of it, even sometimes before it does come. I can illustrate this. I had a letter about 2 or 3 years ago. Excuse me, I don't like platforms. 2 or 3 years ago, I had a letter from a good friend of mine who was in a small college in the Midwest, He'd taken an assistant professorship there, and he'd been there for some time, and he wrote this letter to me. He said, "Oh, if only I could get some change in my life." He said, "I'm so bored, I'm so unchallenged, you can't believe it. You can't believe it. These people, day after day after day, I see them. I go to the same cafe, I do the same things. If only change could come." A week later, mark you, a week later, a letter came to me from someone else whom I knew, who was saying that they were overwhelmed by the changes that had come into their lives. Oh my God, how am I going to cope with it all? Changes every day, changes all the time. And I thought, this illustrates that ambivalence that we sense in ourselves toward change. And yet remember, there is that instinctual feeling that we have that somehow change is necessary for growth. Everything changes. I can remember very clearly when I first discovered how challenging change could be. I was a youngster, I was about 10 years of age, and I'd up until that point had a fairly ordered life. There was a rather nasty gentleman called Adolf Hitler who tried to interfere, but I don't remember anything about him, so I had a relatively quiet life. You've probably never heard of him. I had a relatively quiet life until I was about 10, and then at the school I was attending, change began to happen quite rapidly, but the impact of change was brought home to me in a very sudden, and as I look back upon it, a very amusing way, I had fancied myself as something of a thespian. Don't say that if you have a list. Something of a thespian, something of a theatrical type. I was only 10 or 11, but I thought, yes, a future awaits me on the stage. Mercifully, it didn't. Not mercifully for me, but... and of course, in the school I was at, one had to participate in Shakespeare. It was very important. Shakespeare was the foundation of just about everything that we learned and spoke, the English language itself. The quality of mercy 'tis not strained, it droppeth as a gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. 'Tis twice blessed, it blesses him. No. That's Portia's speech from Shylock. Anyway, I was given my great opportunity on the boards, as they say. My great opportunity at the age of about 10 or 11, and I was slated to play a herald. Don't ask what a herald is. A herald usually has 3 or 4 words in a play. Anyway, I was slated to be the herald, and I got to wear a tabard. You know what a tabard is? It wouldn't work today, but a tabard is a little sort of thingy. Anyway, it's like a little thingy. And heralds in Shakespeare's time wore thingers, I guess. And I was to come in, and I had a line. I was very careful to learn my lines. I had to come in, and I think the King of France, who was obviously one of the senior boys in the school, was sitting on the throne, and I had to come in and say, "My liege, the King of England awaits without." That was my entire bit. And of course we rehearsed this because the parents and all the school governors were going to come for the performance, and so we performed it a great deal. And we had everything marked out on the little stage there, everything that we had to do, the scenery, the doors we had to go through. So I knew where I had to come from, the door I had to go through how I had to turn to the king and say, "My liege," you see, and so on. So the great night came. I was in my tabard, which was, I thought, rather becoming, frankly, at the age of 11. At least it was a change from a school blazer. And to my horror, I discovered that the scenery which we had been using and the stage directions which we had been taught to observe for weeks prior to the play, it had all been changed around. And so I couldn't find the door. I didn't know how to get in onto the stage to speak my precious lines. And so somebody eventually said, one of our teachers or whatever in the wings, "This way, you fool." But I learned a valuable lesson from that foul humiliation. And so it was. I learned to cope with change more effectively. Things will change. Things we had thought predictable change. They do change. And I think we can see here the germs of a very important spiritual lesson that sometimes we find it difficult to learn. The transformation spiritually that we seek lies in change. Change is inevitable in our experience. Some of the changes that come into our lives are not welcome. Some of the changes that come into our lives we resist and indeed fear. And yet there is, as Unity says, a blessing to be brought out of every change that may occur in our lives. The ancient Greek philosophers, and forgive me for talking about those aged old men in Athens, because I know today it's not entirely correct to remember their contribution to human experience, but they fastened upon one or two central truths. And I think the understanding of change and its necessity and its presence in human experience was one of those truths that they settled upon. They saw that everything goes through change. They called it metamorphosis. Two Greek words, metamorphe, after the change, metamorphosis. And they saw that even rocks change. When I go and walk on the beach out in the San Juans there with Carol, I look at a little pebble or even a grain of sand. And I know that, I don't know how many million years ago, but I know that at some point in time, in the continuity in which we live, that we call eternity, that little grain of sand or that rock that little pebble was probably a rock, one of those darn great rocks back there on the trail. Even rocks are in the process of change. Everything is changing. And we must embrace that possibility. Not with fear or loathing, but with the willingness to learn and to reach out and say, what must I get from this transformation that may take place in me? And I've thought as I've grown older, how many changes back 10, 20, 30, 40, I won't go beyond that, years ago, did I regard at the time as baneful, as unfortunate, as unwarranted, as unprofitable in any sense. And yet, looking back on those changes, I see that I grew by passing through them. I changed. And you see, the spiritual understanding that we seek is to be found in transformation, folks. I think most people would say that. We need to be transformed in some way or another to change before we can grow spiritually. And if we look at change in a more beneficent light, in a friendlier light, then change can be our companion and our help and our strength, and can move us closer to what we want, which is, of course, the oneness with God. And here's the ultimate mystery behind change. This is the paradox. Now I come to it. Change, yes. For heaven's sake, let's do something about ear mics. That would be a great change, wouldn't it? But now we come to the, as it were, the crux, the paradox. Change, 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 eternal change. That's the name of the game in the universe in which we live. But, and we say this in Unity, but back of all change, undergirding all change, there is the one great principle of loving intelligence that we call God. You can call it anything that you want. Anything that you want. I admire the Buddhists because they don't have a personal God as we understand it. They see God as that, or what we would call God, as that unifying, supporting principle that undergirds all that there is. Either there is something or there ain't. You can't have it both ways. You have change, endless change, but a consummation, devoutly to be wished, no doubt, a consummation in something that we call God, the principle, the guiding principle behind all things, in which we are always included. There is no place, I'm going to do a double negative on you, there is no place where God is not. There is no place where God is not. God, as the unifying, guiding principle that is the universe, is there. Otherwise, it would be chaos. I've many times spoken to quite eminent physicists at great universities, and they've said, I don't know why, but if there wasn't a unifying principle, I'm not using the argument from design, that's a touchy one, for professional reasons, philosophically, I'm not going to go there, but they have said to me, if there wasn't a unifying principle underneath the experience that we call the universe, there could be no coherent universe, nothing that we could understand, nothing that we would be in, because there'd be no room, no place for us. And yet the wonder is there is a place for us. We do have lives that we consider coherent, however tricky they may sometimes be. But we get this innate sense, and I go back to what I said at the beginning. We go back to this innate sense, this almost primordial sense that we have, that through change, and the way that we deal with change, we shall come closer to our understanding and to our oneness with that principle. This is the Buddhist way. This is our way in unity. This was Jesus' way. When Jesus called his disciples to him, he invited into their lives some of the most extraordinary change. And I just want to read you this passage, very brief passage, because it's always moved me inexpressibly. This very brief passage from the book, the Gospel of Mark. Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee when he saw Simon and his brother Andrew on the lake at work with a casting net, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Come with me, and I will make you fishers of men." And at once, without hesitation, they left their nets and followed him. When Jesus had gone a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who were in the boat overhauling their nets. He called them, and, leaving their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men, they went off to follow him. Can you imagine in those days, 2,000 years ago, what that call meant in terms of change? You didn't leave your native village. You didn't leave your livelihood. You didn't walk away from everything that was familiar. In many instances, you weren't allowed to do so. Even in Elizabethan times in Britain, you couldn't leave your native village because you weren't allowed to. It was where you had to be. And yet these men, as we read, this is, I think, one of the most authentic stories in the Scripture, in the New Testament anyway. Those men unhesitatingly left everything that represented security, invited the most extraordinary change into their lives. And they did it, it seems, without hesitation. There aren't any motels or McDonald's on the corners of highways. There aren't any highways, It's a massive decision, huge change. And I think they did it because I think they saw in Jesus' eyes something that we feel and experience all too rarely in ourselves, an utter trust in the supporting principle of the universe in which we live. We would call it Father, God, anything you want. You can say Father, Mother God, which is preferable. You can say Mother God if you like. You can say no God at all, which would be preferable, because you're going to get into trouble if you use the God. We'll use the word God anyway. What you have to say is that these days, what you have to say is that there is a unifying principle in unity. We call it the divine intelligence, the supreme intelligence, any kind of adjective you wish to add. That intelligence that weaves it all together, holds it together. But in order to gain a greater understanding of that, in order to come closer to it, we have to move through change. It's inevitable. And the attitude with which we move through change, the positive attitude that we adopt, helps us to accomplish this task, which is not only inevitable, but which I think is part of everything that most of us in our hearts might truly hold dear. I'm finished.